there, and welcome, Virtual Space Hero community, to yet another Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn Live. And we are continuing our conversation about remote and hybrid work environments. And we're diving into a topic that is very close to my heart. And I do know that today I have the perfect person to talk to about it, because we're talking about communication, and we're talking in particular about async communication, asking the question, how can we become a pro at async communication? I'll tell you a little bit later as well about a very exciting project that we were running for a multinational, and we were scaling it almost globally. And it had to do a lot with async communication, because as we will be talking about it, we are being reminded all the time that async communication is based on very good and very clear, precise writing skills. And what we were asked at Virtual Space here is to design a writing course. And we were doing that in very small units with micro learnings, live sessions, and also peer sessions. It was a program that evolved over in total 6 weeks, and it was then scaled in several countries. And it was super exciting because it brings us back to the roots of communication in general, but also I learned a lot for myself again about interpersonal communication and the way I'm also communicating, even not written, but just with my husband. So it was fantastic. I learned a lot, and I'm super happy that today we can dive even deeper into the topic with a person who works on this topic on a daily basis. And he's an async communication pro, a modern work coach at Atlassian. And with this, I'm opening the virtual doors for Mark Groove, connecting from the UNS. Hi there, Mark.
Hello. Welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for making time in your calendar. It's fantastic to have you. I'm really so excited because async communication is something that you always hear when we talk about hybrid or remote work, right? But
Oh,
it's
yeah.
something that barely we dive into, hopefully as deep as we're going to do it today.
Amen to that. Well, it's one of those things where with async, especially, we talk about it a lot. It sounds really good, but it's honestly, it takes a lot of effort. You got to be really intentional with it. And that's usually where that comes up as an issue. So I can't wait to
Mm.
dive into this a little bit more.
Fantastic. But Mark, let's jump back a little bit to your background.
Oh,
You
yeah.
are a modern work coach. I love that. I had never had a modern work coach here on my stage. And you work for Atlassian. So help us understand, how did you get the job? Did you create it yourself? Wait. And
Little bit,
what are you
little bit.
doing?
So my background, I've worked in transformation, organizational change, but I've always been a fan of tooling. I've always been a fan that says, you've got to support your practices with good tools if you want to help them be sticky. So I was always an Atlassian fan for the longest time. Joined the company about 3 years ago, helping some of our largest enterprise customers as they went through change journeys. And over time, I kind of started sharing a lot of what we did externally. I started telling people about, hey, you know what? We've been doing this async kind of remote thing for a very long time. Here's some of the things we do. It's actually really helpful, and people loved it. And so I said, hey, could I go tell more people about this? Could I go work with more customers and even continue to work with some of our internal teams? And they said, do it. And so for the last about year, I've been working as a modern work coach, helping both our teams as well as external teams, figure out how do they work in this crazy new world we're in this modern world we're in, as I like to say.
And I love that. That's amazing. And if you think back, how did you yourself in general dive into the topic of new ways of working or hybrid work, virtual work, whatever you consider yourself working in?
So it's interesting. It's one of those little things where probably about 5, 6 years ago, I was definitely a on the other side of that fence. I was definitely someone who's like, I was in the office. I'm like, yeah, you can leave for a day if you need some personal things, but we collaborate together in person. And it wasn't until I actually had the opportunity to work for Atlassian where my role was going to be remote, and I was like, all right, I want to work for Atlassian. I'm willing to try this, and it just opened my eyes. I was like, wow. And what it came down to was a lot of those concerns I had around collaboration. I found were didn't really weren't really rooted in anything. It had to do with the fact that I assumed that we couldn't make practices to help support some of those organic collaboration points when in fact we could, and if we just had to try a little bit. And it was amazing, the experience. So ever since then, I've seen myself as an advocate, saying I've seen the other side. It's not like I started out this way. I've seen over there. This is really good. Like, we can make this happen if we try.
Cool, 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 nice. So if we talk about async communication, you already mentioned one word that I think is very central to what new ways of working are for me. And it's the thing about being intentional.
Hmm.
So if you mention being intentional, how would you describe what being intentional means, and to what areas would you say that it sort of connects to, not only communication but also other
Yeah.
stuff?
Oh yeah, and that's exactly it. The word intentional is rooted in all of it, because when I think about what we would do when we would work together, maybe even in synchronous, we could be remote but working in meetings. We would assume that the only way we could push information back and forth is if you and I are right now talking to each other. But the thing is we have to take a step back, and we have to think, and that's what intentionality is all about. It's taking that step back and thinking, is there a different way I can maybe play with this, maybe do something with this? And taking that brief moment to then go and experiment and try something new. And that's where things, whether it be how we communicate, it could be how we connect with other people. Think about the last couple of years. A lot of people struggled with connection. It's finding those fun things you can do in a sync or an async way to help kind of bring people together and help people bond. So a ton of the work we do, and it can essentially be made in a sync or a asynchronous way. We just have to be intentional about
Absolutely. And I think it also it reminds us so much about how we need to rethink the way we communicate, because the moment that we are in a synchronous communication setting, even though it's also not nice that people are just babbling around before making up their mind while they are talking, or what they want to say, or what the objective is, right? We do know that in an async world, or async, or primarily async
it.
working world, it's even more important. So when we talk, and this is now bringing me also to one of the questions that we discussed before, when we talk about asynchronous communication at work, how did you at Atlassian, if you have the background, or how did you yourself start working asynchronously? What were the most important learnings that you need to
Ooh.
figure out, all the tools that for you work well? And of
So,
course, please mention the Atlassian's tools that you're working with,
of
right?
course, well, and that's one of the things I like to pride in my job is, like, I'm not here to sell anybody tools. I'm here to talk about the practices. And so I'll talk about our practices, and then we do use our tools to help support those. We built those from our practices. So for us, a big thing for me, and actually for the entire Atlassian family, uh, as we've kind of gone out there, is we've realized we need to get really intentional about things like just how teams come together in an async way. And so whether it be doing things like creating team spaces in Confluence. So Confluence being our wiki solution, saying, hey, we've got to be intentional how we set this up. We also come up, we're a Slack user. So coming up with, how do we use Slack? One of the things that when I first started in the company that always resonated with me with our usage of Slack was, again, intentionality of using it. When I first started not using it before, they said, all right, when you Slack somebody, don't just Slack them and say hi and then wait for a reply. That's a very sync process, as the mindset right there. You say, hi, hey, I have a good question about X, Y, and Z, da 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 da. Because guess what? Now I've given you the payload, and maybe you get to it right away. Maybe it takes a few hours, but that's what helped encourage some of that kind of asynchronous pattern within our company. So those little things like that. And so whether it's that, whether it's our programs around, again, remote coming together. So we've got this intentional togetherness program that does everything from in-person events to sync and async remote events, where it's like, hey, go do this volunteer activity, and you can all do it kind of on your own time and then share your stories on it. Things like that are practices we use. I also like one of the tools we use that we've kind of really grown over the last few years is called Atlas, and it's really come into play to help us remove the need for that dreaded in-person or remote sync status meeting. Because I think we've all been on those kind of things where we'd sit there for a few hours to give a 5-minute status, and we just really hate all that time. And so for us, we've actually built a tool to actually say, well, what if we gave that status in a central place where you can get an aggregated aggregated email once a week telling you here's the status of everything. And so we've
Mhm.
started to use things like that to again change the way we work. We're no longer jumping into a Thursday status meeting. We're now going in on Thursday or Friday, updating our Atlas ticket, and then on Monday we say, all right, cool, where do we need to focus our time on this week? So things like that have what's helped us kind of think about how do we work in a little bit more asynchronous way, even though we could come together for those sorts of things.
If you look at the tool side of what we're talking about, what would you say, if it's possible to define that even, what would you say is
Mhm.
the basis for asynchronous collaboration in your team or in your different teams? Because I'm not even
Mhm.
sure if it's necessarily always the same basis across organizations,
Oh,
across the whole organization. What do you think about that?
so big thing for me here, and it goes back to our practices. What I encourage every team I work with to do is actually to develop a working agreement in a synchronous way around how they want to work asynchronously, how they want to use their tools. It's a really simple exercise. We actually have it in our team playbook, which is a set of our practices we freely publish out there. And it basically will help you say, all right, why would we use this tool this way as this team? Because, for us, we try to breed that autonomy within our teams. We've got some larger tools we use internally, but we may use something like Slack for certain types of communication. We may use something like Loom, which is our video kind of async tool, for other types. And so we leave it to each team to kind of come up with how they want to do it. But we encourage them to then do that because, again, we don't want to dictate that down because the same process won't work for every team.
Mm. Yeah. And this is so interesting because I think I'm just thinking about a team that I'm working with. It's also an
Mhm.
international team of three. We are three in total, and we are also sort of still trying to figure out what tool works best for us.
Mm,
And I was talking to so many people, but of course I got so many different answers because it always depends on the team.
right? You
If
probably
you,
got you probably got a new answer for every person you talk to. And so it kind of it
absolutely,
goes back to that intentionality. It's like stepping back and saying like, okay, well, what am I trying to accomplish? And then looking
yeah.
around and be like, what could potentially be something I can experiment with that maybe fits that bill?
Mm. And this reminds me also when we talk about modern work or new ways of
Mhm.
working, a lot about the MVP, like those
Oh, yes.
small changes, Kaizen mindset, whatever, because we were looking for the perfect solution, right? And I was in charge of that. And so the project got there for like 1.5 years. And I was always postponing it, always asking more people. I was like, God, what are we going to do with these three? We're only three, but we don't manage our communication. And at the end, of course, our business coach told us what you exactly told us now. Like, okay, I think it's time for a team agreement. You decide, you test it out 3 weeks later, and then you revise it. And that's
Oh,
also
yeah.
like a new mindset, right? That we need to have when we look at new ways of working or modern work.
Oh, 100%. And I think, and it doesn't have to be hard. That's the thing. I think a lot of people look at something like, wow, we struggle with our async communication. And so because we're not, again, thinking really, we think it's just a big problem. When in fact, if you just do a couple things, like for us, a couple of our practices, like I said, the working agreement's a great one. The other one we do is we call it a ritual reset. Ritual resets are a fantastic way for an existing team, look at your schedule. What do you have that's synchronous today? And determine which ones you want to keep, which ones you think maybe should change a little bit. Maybe there's some async practices we want to build into something to help reduce its impact on us. And honestly, which ones should just get eliminated? And doing that regular house cleaning on a regular basis, every 6 months or so, run that 60-minute play. And so for us, it's little things like that. It doesn't take a lot of work, but it's amazing the results it can reap.
What you said, that the term is a ritual reset. So ritual reset,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Nice one, nice one. Yeah, like that a lot. Like the idea a lot. Thanks for that. Um, Mark, if you think about just use cases, when
Mhm.
would you say that at Atlassian or in your teams, or when do you encourage clients to really use synchronous communication or rather
Mm.
use asynchronous communication?
There's a couple scenarios that I think definitely warrant things like sync communication, things like one-on-ones with your people leaders, maybe with if you're a leader with your people. That feels weird when it's done in an asynchronous way. You may collaborate on things in an asynchronous way, but really that time to connect is important. I also found things like really rapid brainstorming. Like let's say we've got to try to solve a problem, coming together for a synchronous kind of session can really do a lot of energy for that. But again, you can also bring some async pieces into that. And then
Mm,
another big thing for us is this idea of intentional togetherness. The idea that, yes, we could probably make everything async. Like I would be willing to bet that you could make almost anything async. But the question is should everything be async? And I think that's where a lot of what we as people go through. We need that connection. We need that ability to kind of say, hey, I see you as a person, and that requires that. And so
mhm,
those are really important things for the sync world. But for the async world, let's take everything else. I mentioned things like status meetings. There's no need for us to spend that time there. Actually, things like brainstorming, when it's just regular brainstorming, you can actually inject some async practices in. Send out a Trello board and say, hey, fill out your ideas on here before the session. It actually
mm,
saves time from the brainstorming session because we did some of the stuff beforehand. Things like
mm,
that. And then just again, looking at the different reasons why you meet. I think that's the big thing. It's like we look at this thing, it's like, what are we trying to accomplish here? And then asking that question, can we accomplish this thing without coming together? And is that good for us? And if you can
mm.
answer those questions, all of a sudden now you can start kind of saying, well, no, we don't need that brainstorming session this way. We don't need to do 2 hours on that. Let's book an hour, and we'll do a half hour. We'll send out a board a day before and have you fill out ideas beforehand. Things like that, and that's where we found it at Atlassian. We use a lot.
That sounds fantastic. And you know what? That brings me already a little bit to the next question, because
Yeah.
I got a colleague who was asking me how to implement asynchronous workflows, processes, or mindset. And I want to pick up on a comment that you
Mm,
were saying, like gradually starting, hey, let's implement a Trello board before the meeting where you brainstorm or do
mhm,
something asynchronously. Because I'm just thinking a company that you have a lot of experience working with different external customers
mhm.
who establish like or who want to implement asynchronous workflows. It takes a long, and it's probably not radical. So how would that work?
So it's interesting. Like I worked with a customer back a little while ago, last summer, and they were a user of our Confluence tool, and the thing is they were struggling to get themselves in this idea of like how do we do more async work ahead of time to then lead into something that reduces the friction later on down the road when we do come together in a sync way. And so for them, it was really learning how to use practices and products together. And so thinking about for them, they had this giant like status meeting they would have every week, and 50 people, 2 hours is a very expensive meeting. No one wants to be there for that, right? So what they started doing is they says, all right, before we do this meeting, we're going to establish a new kind of workflow for us. This owner did says, I'm going to go through and I'm going to create an agenda page. We're going to send that page out, gather feedback asynchronously during the week, and then come up to Thursday, we're then going to publish the final one. And then on Friday, for any topics we need, that's what we'll cover there. And all of a sudden, they saw that 2 hour meeting drop to an hour because they realized they can communicate a lot of those things asynchronously. And they
Mm,
also found the number of people who needed to attend dropped in half because guess what? People were just attending because they thought they needed to be there. They didn't know if they needed to be. Now we've got some intentional structure around what we're going to cover. So for
mm,
them, again, a workflow a lot of people think of is like, well, I got to do A, B, and C. Yeah, but it's also thinking about what are the things you do before, during, and after something that you can inject async practices into. An
mhm, mhm,
Another good example within Atlassian that I absolutely love, it's a we do our leadership team does this. And so every week our product leadership team, we call it PLT, comes together to look at new ideas for the organization. And so what they do is they use Confluence and they have someone present out fill out a page with all this information. When they come into the session, what they do is with that page in hand, is take the first 10 minutes of that session to actually have everyone review and comment on the page. And so it's silent. It's just everyone going through, adding comments, feedback. And then what would happen is that instead of just talking about the page, the rest of that session, they would actually focus in on the comments and the questions. They would use that to again drive that behavior a little differently. So it's not just rambling about a page. It's actually saying, all right, we've all consumed this. We all have shared understanding here. Now let's find those areas where we might be still off on different sides of this table and kind of answer those, figure out what we want to do about these. And so it's
mm,
those little things I found in kind of the building out, like again, how do you go from A to Z, from sync to async and so forth? It's being intentional about those steps along the way.
This also just reminds me a little bit about a conversation I had on LinkedIn with Elise Keith from Lucid Meetings,
Hmm.
because apparently research shows that only 20% of managers are really well trained in facilitating meetings. Because what you were saying also means, or for
Hmm.
me, it implies that you need to be really a good meeting facilitator to take most out of the fewer sync sessions that you might be
Oh,
having,
yes.
right?
Well, and one of the things I'll say is you don't have to be an expert facilitator, but you need to know the tips and the tricks along the way. And one thing, shameless but not shameless plug, because we've actually put out some really cool content online. We've got a free video series, 30 minutes each. One's on how to run more effective meetings. One's around how to work in a more async distributed world. Both of those, you take the you look at those two sets of videos, they give you a lot of great tips in terms of, hey, as a meeting facilitator, I don't need to go take like a week-long course on how to facilitate sessions. No, I just got to think about, I need to have an agenda. I need to have, I need to make sure I understand like what's the working agreement in the meeting, things like that. And so that's what I found is like, yeah, good facilitation is huge, but it doesn't, again, just like it's not this giant mountain to climb. Just need those little tips and tricks along the way.
But I think it's really a pity, because if we look at organizations, on how many organizations are wasting millions of euro or dollars or whatsoever
Right.
throughout whatever period we're talking about, because of badly facilitated meetings. And also there was, I'm not sure if it was a Stanford study, I can't remember now, but that people even need to recover, to plan for recover time after bad
I
meetings.
know, right?
Like, oh my God.
I used to, fun story. I used to, back in prior lives, I used to do like those Thursday status meetings. And the funny thing was, we'd be in that status meeting for 4 hours. And right after that status meeting, we all went to the local bar. That was our recovery time. I missed that. That was when we connected. And I missed the connection, but I don't miss that status meeting.
Dear God, energy draining, incredible.
I know,
Yeah.
right?
If you think about like different perspectives, let's think about managers, but also employees, or
Hmm.
employees without managerial tasks. What are best practices for those two different types of workers to consider when it comes to asynchronous practices? What are the most important things that come to your mind?
I think for leaders, the biggest thing is being conscious of how you work in an async way. As a leader, you demonstrate things that your people will look to and try to say, all right, that's our path forward, that's the thing that we're going to do. So if you as a leader do everything in a sync fashion, you ask for things, you require immediate status on things, all of a sudden you're creating a culture that isn't going to be very amenable to an async way of working. And you're going to ask yourself, like, why isn't this working? Well, you got to look at yourself first. So the biggest thing for me is, as a leader, go out there and think about, how do you want to demonstrate async in your world? Now, as a
Mm,
team member out there, that doesn't mean you just have to follow your leader. The idea is you can also lead at any level. And so for me, as you go out there and you establish meetings, as you start conversations, I always like to say, start with that question: can this be an async? Uh, can this be done async? So maybe I'm going to set up a meeting with somebody. Well, could I Slack them instead? Maybe I needed to get some feedback on something. And instead of saying, I'll put 5 minutes, I'm going to put 20 minutes on the calendar with you to ask you a 5 minute question. Instead, I'm going to send you a 5 minute loom that has all my thoughts on there. And then you can add comments in the video. Those are
mm,
things that you can do to actually help influence the culture of your team to say, hey, we don't necessarily need a meeting for this. We can do things around the clock, because guess what? That's where we're working nowadays.
mm, and so also here, like taking baby steps or small steps in changing the mindset and the way of working in different teams and throughout the whole organization. If we
Hmm.
look at the process of implementing or establishing asynchronous workflows across a bigger organization, I'm just thinking back about one organization that I was
Yeah.
very involved in. It's an NGO, Europe-wide organization, and we implemented Slack. Let me think. It was probably 6 years ago. And I think we also had people from many different age groups, different technical backgrounds. And I think really we were like, at least for 2 more years, I think 2 more years really, where in some teams there was still email communication referring to the Slack conversation to bring everybody there.
Yep.
And still, if I look there, honestly, there are not really thread messages. So it's like driving you crazy anyways.
You're like, what's and they're in different places too, and you're like, well, crap, it started here, now it's there.
Totally, totally. So, but what is your experience? How long can it? I know it's a very
Yeah.
tough question. It always depends. But have you got a feeling out of the many cases that you've seen how long it at least takes you, or it can take you on average to
A
make
lot
such
of
a
it comes down
swift?
to it can be 6 to 12 months depending on that organization, but the big thing I found that has helped accelerate that is things like the working agreements. Things like when I can
Mm,
look at something and say, hey, when we want to communicate, we put in our working agreement, start with Slack, like, and then thus when that comes up and we see all of a sudden email going around, I as a team member now have something I can point to, be like, hey folks, I thought we agreed to Slack. And they're like, oh, you're right. And the
mm,
question can come up. So like, should this be in Slack? Should we change our working agreement? 9 times out of 10, they're like, nope, I just forgot. Because
mm,
people are human. They'll forget to kind of go that way. So using that as an ability and then coming back to that, you said that earlier. How do you come back and revisit that working agreement on a regular basis? It helps to cement in that, like, what do we want our work to look like? How do we want our culture to play out? So that would be the one area I've seen when again, that intentionality word, when not done in place, when we say, hey, we're just going to go use Slack. Yeah, Slack and email are going to mix, and it's going to feel bad. You're going to feel like you're overloaded and nothing's any place. But if we start saying, no, no, this is how we want to do it, and we become really explicit with that, it feels weird at first, but all of a sudden, again, it accelerates that process of adoption and say, okay, we did agree to this. I was part of that. And so I'm going to help contribute to making this sticky.
And it's interesting because when we talk about team agreements, so it's really embarrassing to say so, but the small team that I'm working with, and I do a lot of new work consultancy, and so of course I do have my own team agreement template. I work with the teams with that, and
Excellent.
then I don't know what's the English saying, but it's like in Spanish you say like the house of a shoemaster, you have bad shoes or something like that.
Oh yeah, yeah. The cobbler's kid never has shoes. That's what we'll say, right? Exactly.
Well, because in our virtual team, we had an implicit team agreement that grew out of the past like 5 years working together, right? And I'm
Yep.
telling all the big companies, come on, use my team agreement. What? You don't have a written team agreement? Dear God. Okay.
Can I see yours? And
So,
you're like,
but our business coach brought us back to our team agreement. And just thinking about that, because my experience when I work with companies is really that there is not enough weight put or importance given to
yeah.
those team agreements yet, as I know in my own case, to be very fair in this team, also to be very honest about it. How do you work with that, or what is the process if we talk about team agreements with teams and you help them, you support them in the process?
And that's a hard question because it really comes down to how do we help people see the value of this? And a lot of it comes down to the stories we can tell. It's showing the examples. And to your point, I think I'm a big fan of the folks, the idea that coaches need coaches, and the idea that, even for my team, like we didn't have a working agreement for the longest time. And so we've actually said, hey, we need some help getting this put together. And so for us, it's being able to go out there and tell the stories of the value of it and really try to make it as simple as possible, because I think the biggest thing that teams look at is teams are busy today, especially today, with as constrained as the world is becoming, as fast as things are moving. We're like, where do I have the time? And so it's working with teams to say, well, I'm not asking for a ton. I'm like, let's grab 1 hour. That's all we need. Because a lot of times you'll go in and be like, let's do a whole day workshop on this. And people are like, no. You're like, I don't have that, but usually I can get an hour. That's what I've been finding. And so with an hour, I try to focus on that most important thing that can help that team and just talk with them. I can find out, should we focus something like a working agreement in a certain space? Maybe they're underwater right now. And so doing something like a ritual reset or something like that is actually a better use of that time. But it's
Mm,
trying to help them make those little improvements every day that they can. Because
mm,
again, what does they say? If you do an inch every day, you get feet, you get miles in years, kind of thing.
mm. And what do you do with those teams? Because you come in as the modern work coach and maybe they don't have access to you in a year, or not all the teams have access to you as they wanted to have to you, like on a weekly basis or
Oh
something.
yeah, yeah.
So do you recommend them to establish, or maybe to think about if somebody takes over like that modern work, I don't know, regulator role or whatever you want to call it, in terms of somebody who is explicitly in charge of always looking at how do we live what we agreed to?
Yeah. I think one of the big things I found is help. Like my role as a coach is, if anything, enablement. It's to help them figure out how they can do this for themselves. And so it's giving them the resources and helping them see how they can, reference our playbook, which all of a sudden we give you a step-by-step guide. We try to make it super easy. Here, run this once a quarter or once a month. And so for me, it's working with them to do something to that effect and establish it into their rhythm. I find that if things aren't in part of a team's cadence, if they're not part of their rituals, they don't tend to happen. And so when we
Hmm.
start establishing those rituals, even with that owner being maybe underwater, if I can help them establish it in their rituals, all of a sudden we start seeing that start happening. And so it's always good to find an advocate. Like I work with a customer who they have an advocate who is out there working with teams and is doing amazing work. But at the same time, that advocate, something changes in their life. They move into a different team or a different company. I don't want it to die on the vine with a person. So team enablement is a huge piece. So working with them to share that and make it accessible is huge.
Mm-mm. And probably then also, if I just think about it, because in some teams I do suggest that they have rotating roles when it comes to, for example,
Yeah.
meetings, because enabling means that we take over different roles at different
Yes.
times so that everybody sort of learns that role or learns that mindset or thinks in that way.
It's one of those things where back in some prior lives, I was a scrum master, agile coach, and as I worked with some of my teams, that's exactly what we would do. Is we'd take things like the ceremonies we'd run, and I would say, as your scrum master, I'm going to be there to help support you, but hey, Mike, you're going to facilitate this, or hey, Julie, you're going to go facilitate this one. And it was getting to that idea of like, you own your improvement, you own this, and so helping them see that, I always found that as a great technique to actually get people to feel like, okay, this is my team. You're not just helping apply this to my team.
Mm-mm. And so, for all of you out there, because we're coming to an end, but there are maybe probably a lot of questions still that we would like to dive into, but time is limited. So, we picked up the most important ones that also you provided us with. Thank you very much for that. You see here, I'm just sharing the Atlassian Team Playbook link. Check that web page out. A lot of sources there. It's amazing. And of course, follow Mark on LinkedIn. Check him out, Mark Kruth. You find him on LinkedIn, always sharing very interesting content. Mark, back to you. I'm very thankful that you had the time to dive with me into those topic of how to async like a pro. I feel much more like empowered after this 30 minutes with you. So thank you very much for that.
Oh,
It was
Barbara,
a
thanks so
big
much.
pleasure. And well, I hope we stay in touch. And thanks again for sharing all your knowledge here with us.
And thank you all for joining in too, for those who are watching. And again, if you have any questions, you want to go deeper, reach out. I love to work with teams to help them figure out how do we solve this async problem out there. So feel free. I'd love to share some resources with you. So thanks again, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Mark. So thank you very much, LinkedIn Virtual Space Hero community. We got some of the questions beforehand as well, because I do know that not everybody can make him herself available during the moment that we are live. But don't worry, because first of all, the live link, the streaming link, is the same link where you can watch the recording. And as I always encourage you, please send me also your questions beforehand, and I'll make sure to bring them into the conversation. Well, with that, I'm saying thank you very much. Have a wonderful good morning, afternoon, or evening, and I'll see you next week. Goodbye.